Welcome to Real Atheology. In the past, I've crafted, presented, and defended a deductive argument against the existence of God which drew upon the ontological perfection of God, and this argument was called the problem of non-God objects. This video is going to be kind of a basic rundown of that argument. I don't actually use the argument anymore because I'm not really very convinced that it's a very good argument. That said, I think that most of the objections are also not very good objections. I've found that the argument is actually pretty valuable as it raises a number of interesting questions, even if it's not a great argument in and of itself. So here it is, the problem of non-God objects. As I've said, a non-God object is just any object that isn't God. So central to this argument is the concept of the null world, or God world as I've previously called it. The null world is that possible world wherein God exists, but nothing else exists. So it's that possible world where God exists alone. He refrains from ever creating anything outside of himself. Obviously then, one assumption of the argument is that God's choice to create additional objects, or to refrain from such an activity, must be a free decision rather than one born of necessity. The argument's structure, I think, was pretty straightforward. Premise 1, if God exists, then the null world is the unique best possible world. Premise 2, if the null world is the unique best possible world, then God would sustain the null world eternally. Premise 3, this is not the null world, quite obviously. Conclusion, therefore God does not exist. The idea here is that if God exists, he's an ontologically perfect being, meaning that he has all possible great-making properties, things like power, love, knowledge, and he has them all to their maximally compossible degrees, and no such property to any lesser degree. Now, a world entirely composed of such an unsurpassably great being would be a world composed of all those great-making properties to their maximally compossible degrees, and no such properties to any lesser degree. It seems then that if the null world represents an ontological quality of world to which no other world can compare, then it is the unique best possible world. Now usually this is where the objections begin to flow. Of course, one might object that the null world, a world in which only God exists, is not necessarily the best possible world, because perhaps there exists some unique source of goodness not found within the nature of God, and so needs to be created. This source of goodness that exists outside of God and is fully independent of God. However, I'd reply that this move is best reserved for discussions of lower views of God, which fail to be unsurpassably great. For if God is unsurpassably great, then there is no great-making property, which is not already, in some fundamental sense, found within the nature of God. In the same way, then, when she creates, God isn't getting any fundamentally new good things. Rather, God just creates additional examples of the goods which already exist within her nature. So if this point objects to an argument, it is an argument quite different than the one being presented here. Now, an omniscient being, an all-knowing being, would of course be aware of the truth of premise 2, of the fact that himself existing alone for eternity as the lone fixture in the null world makes it the unique best possible world. Now, knowing this and being morally perfect, God would be in possession of an indefeasible motivation to refrain from creating anything. Such a being would know that any creation act would represent an affront to the perfection of the null world to which he belongs. Why is this? Because any alteration in overall purity by the introduction of a universe or of any other non-God object would be a degradation of the overall purity and therefore the overall quality of the null world. For example, let's say God creates a person. Well, what's wrong with that? Wouldn't God want moral agents to exist? Well, the problem is that unless this person is a clone of God, overall quality will be lost. To suggest God is in the degrading business is to suggest an imperfect God, rather than an unsurpassable God. What do you guys think of perfection-based arguments of this type? Are they of any value? Is there potential for successful deductive disproof of classical theism here? Is there any hope of employing concerns like this to undermine the explanatory power of theism by undermining the prior probability of God's creating anything at all? Or maybe you just think that arguments of this type are failures and are completely useless. Wherever you fall, I want to know. Share your questions, your criticisms. And again, I want to thank those supporting me on Patreon. It really means a lot. The top Patreons this week are Daniel Stenning, Ryan King, Mason Colbert, John Danaher, Brandon McCleary, St. Nimbus, and the top supporter and current patron saint of Real Atheology, Matt Smith.